Hey, Big Tater here with part 3 of Ruger Mark II disassembly. Once you get all your parts cleaned up, what do you got to do next? You got to do your trigger frame. So let's get started. So look, you got all kinds of blast there, and that's just a mess. So are you gonna try and get in there and clean that with a brush? Wouldn't you love to just be able to take it apart and clean every piece individually? That's the way I usually prefer to do it. So in this video, I'll show all the steps you need to take in order to do that. Remove the screws that are securing your grip panels with a fine screwdriver, and I mean one that's not going to chew up the heads. Remove the slide release mechanism, which the pin that pivots on is also a pivot pin for other things inside, so you're going to want to be cautious when you're taking this out. If you're not a very patient person, you might not want to do this unless you're really pretty relaxed about it, because you will have to finagle a couple of parts back into place after you kind of take the plunge. Pull this pin right up, and it's going to let a couple of pieces get loose in there. After you've taken the pin out, put it on a suitable catcher. Pull the bolt release pin, you'll notice the hammer is free flying. So you're going to grab that and keep track of this piece that fits inside of it. After you've taken out your hammer, you're going to find that this safety mechanism is going to be right there. Now keep track, there's a little detente right here, and that does like to pop out and fall. It does not fling out, but it will fall with the rest of the parts. Now this is a spring-loaded piece that retains the trigger pin. So again, you're going to press down on this metal spring while you push crosswise from the left on the trigger pin. You'll notice that it'll start to slide out, and then you can just simply pull it out. When you pull the pin the rest of the way out, your trigger is simply going to fall down. Now, we've got our pin. You see that groove there? Now that groove is what that spring catches in, which is what retains this pin from coming out. Now notice the flat side of that piece was facing towards the left-hand side of the trigger frame. Now you see how there's a pin in there that fits into the trigger. Now there is no bushing or anything to worry about losing, so you just take this cross pin out, set it aside, dump your trigger out. Only thing left now is the sear. So now, you've got a fully disassembled trigger frame and a whole mess of parts that need to be cleaned. Now, just look at how filthy this thing is. But it will get a lot cleaner. So, clean those up and I'll show you how to put it back together. A lot of parts to go back in, so if you're a little overwhelmed, don't worry about it. What we're going to do is just start at the beginning and just do one little piece at a time. First piece to put in, trigger pin retainer. Has a nice little resting place on the right hand side. Now angle. It's right behind the curve of the bottom of the trigger guard. What you're trying to do, notice the hole for the trigger pin. You're trying to get this down below it. I'm pressing down with my thumbnail on this. Snaps right in. Now I didn't have to put a lot of pressure on this at all, so don't force it, but you just want to work that leading edge right down into that slot there, and it just pops right in and just sits there. Here's how easy this is. Drop it in. Done. bolt release return spring. So again, we're going to have this flat part facing the left hand side of the frame. Now if you were paying attention when you took this apart, you'll remember it goes right in a little groove right here, right in a little hole. You just slide that in with your thumb and it'll look just the way it did before you took it apart. Put the pin in just into the frame and now it'll hit that spring, okay? You're going to have to depress that retaining spring again. Now lift your trigger linkage out of the way. Lift that up. Don't tilt the muzzle end skyward or your little pieces are going to fall out. Now what you want to do is push down on your trigger pin retainer spring at the same time as you try and push the trigger pin back in. Now it'll only go in far enough until it hits the trigger, but you'll have accomplished the process of clearing the spring. And then you can worry later about lining up the trigger. So let's do that. I went ahead and depressed this spring just enough to push the trigger pin in to the point where it's hitting the trigger. Let's line up the trigger. We're going to flick our linkage back into its relaxed position. Push in on the trigger pin while we move the trigger around trying to line up the pivot hole. The trick is to look from the other side and line up the hole. Now you don't want to push the pin all the way through. Only push the pin in enough so that it is through the trigger slightly. You still have to put more pieces in before you can push the pin all the way in. So don't push the pin all the way in at this time. Slide lock. This is the next thing to install. Now the little hole through it is what the trigger pin goes through, so we have to line that up now. Put that part in first, and then hinge the front of it down towards the trigger pivot, and keep that pin there in the groove. All you have to do is slide this into place and line up the hole and put the pin through. Now you will notice I lined this up, most of which I did one-handed, so that this is getting caught by the mechanism again. Now I push my pin in so it would retain it, push the pin the rest of the way in, and it'll go snap, which it did as I was talking. So now you have your catch completely assembled. Good, we're moving right along. Install the detente. And flip this crossbar back down on top of it. Now that is going to be a little tricky. You can't tip the gun over or those pieces are going to fall out. Next thing to do, flip over your sear so that it is facing the other way. Now this sear needs to be lined up just right so that it is just slightly ahead of this catch right here. And the reason for that is when we put our safety in, it has to line up, and this makes the assembly a lot easier to know this. You line up this hook. This hook goes right over that sear, and it locks it in place, which makes further assembly a lot easier. So we're going to have this ball facing somewhat upward so it can't fall out. We're going to set our hook right over that sear on our way in with this safety. And then, after that is engaged, we put the safety through its little slot. Just watch that ball that it doesn't get loose. So we're going to set our safety. We hooked it over the sear. Now we're going into the hole with it. So we've got our safety in its slot. Now, positioning doesn't matter whether it's on fire or unsafe. Obviously there's no round chambered at this time. Now, once we've lined up our hole so that we have our safety mechanism lined up, there we go. Now all we have to do is, as we're holding this safety in place, we're going to put this slide release over its slot, line up the holes, and put the pin in. Put the pin through there, through the trigger frame, and through the safety. Now, You notice our pin went in too far. That's okay. Now all that's left are two things that we have to do. Now continue to hold this safety in place. Pull the pin back so that you have just enough room. Now notice I'm holding the slide release with my thumb, and my index finger is holding the safety. Now I'm going to pull the pin out so that it's just shy, so it's not sticking in the way. Now it's time to put the hammer in. So in order to do that, we are going to make sure the safety is in the on position, on safe. Thumb holding the slide release, index finger holding the safety in place. Now you notice our sear is locked in by the safety, so they can't move. Now that's important. You put this bushing right into the hole there. Now you put this linkage facing down, hanging down. Now once you've lined that up, you put that in there. Slide this assembly down into place. And once you've gotten the pin lined up, just push it right through. Now that was easy. It just slid right in. So you'll know it's right because you won't have to hammer it or anything. You just push it in with your finger. Now if your hammer won't go back, turn the safety off, and then it will. Now you'll notice this is in the cocked position. And when you pull your trigger, your hammer should be able to fall forward. Click it back. It'll feel a little mushy because there's a spring that you haven't put in yet. Now with the hammer in the cocked position, make sure that when you're on safety, you can't pull the trigger. What you'll notice is there's a coil spring. You see that? Right on the sear. Now that little piece, that end of the spring, has to be pushed inward in this groove to the point where when you put a pin through that hole, the pin retains the spring. I'll explain more. When you put this pin through this hole, okay, you're going to start. You should start from the right hand side. Slide the pin in. Now you'll see, this is the pin you took out. With your index finger, move the hammer into the decocked position. You'll get that linkage out of your way. Let go of the trigger. Safety position at this point is irrelevant. Now you're going to slide this pin in some more. Now all you have to do is push that spring down to the point where this pin is going to trap it. Now that you're ready to set this spring, you push the end towards the body of the gun and push your pin in flush. Let go of the spring and it'll be retained by this pin. Okay, so make sure the pin is even on the frame on both sides, and now you have your spring properly installed. We flip our linkage down, we flip our hammer into the cocked position, and our trigger should feel normal. Alright, so we finished with the sear spring. We made sure our hammer functions correctly. It's in the cocked position now. And if you remember from my first video, if you hopefully watched that, you will know that you need the hammer in the decocked position when you're assembling this pistol. Go ahead and put your grips back on, and that's one thing I'm not hesitant to say. Installation is the opposite of removal. So, have fun with that. Very interesting, I learned when I was assembling this. Before looking at this, you really should watch the first part of this video, part 1. But after that, what I noticed after assembling this trigger frame again is I couldn't get my pin to seat back up in there. It wouldn't go all the way through. Now, if you've had problems with this, consider what I'm about to say. What I noticed about assembling this pin was this pin has to go up through this spring guide. Now, simple enough, right? Well, if you take that spring guide out as I instructed in my first video, that's great if you want to clean it. But after disassembling and reassembling the pistol several times, trying to find a way to get that pin all the way in, you know, I figured something was in the wrong place. I thought, well, I'll flip this over, because consider this. On this end here, right, you can take this part out and you can spin that rod and you can clean the end and, you know, wire brush it once you take this guide rod out. The thing is, and I'll show you, if you end up twirling this when you're cleaning it, make sure you keep track of the notch. Now this notch that they use to pin this together, make sure it's in whatever position it was in when you first started messing with the pistol. Because otherwise, if that notch, I noticed my notch has to be up, because this gun has been trained now to have more wear on one side of this than the other. So it's really hard to put the pin through if this fork here is flipped over. So what I did when I had trouble putting it together was I took this apart and I flopped this the other way, and I ended up having to twist this around. You have to compress the spring first and then you twist that piece. So everything lines up except the fork is upside down now, because I tried to put it in the wrong way this time. So that made the pin just fly right back in the way it wanted to. So keep that in mind. And there we have it. Back in business.